Okay. I want to read from Philippians again, chapter 4. So I have a few verses here. I'm going to read Philippians 4, 1 to 13. This is Paul talking. He says, Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. So many of us have this verse, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. We have it on the wall, we have it on, scripture things, that everybody quotes this verse, but take the verse in its context, and what Paul is saying here is there are two extremes in life. Times when I have everything I need, and sometimes when I lack what I need. And I have learned in both of those situations that I can live under those conditions through Christ who strengthens me. So this verse is the end of that, what he just said about, he used these words, abased. That means you're humbled, you're low, you're doing without, you're suffering lack or loss. And then abound means when things are abundant and you have plenty, nothing to worry about. There's plenty of food, plenty of clothes, place to stay, nobody's trying to kill you, And so he says, I have learned how to live in both of those situations. And so this is kind of like a follow-up to what we shared this morning. Gary, to my notes when I shared them with him, and he asked me the following. He said, would you be willing to talk at the dad's meeting a little bit more about how you went through what you went through? So he was saying, how did you keep going as you faced discouragement and felt the difficulties in those situations? And how did you overcome? And how did God keep you faithful? And then he made this comment. He said, the greatest challenge we parents face is remaining an objective voice that can give comfort and perspective, helping our children to keep their eyes on the prize and not to lose heart and faint. So what he's saying is, parents are trying to coach their children through these same things, when they go through loss, when they go through gain. And children can get discouraged, and want to give up if God takes them through something where there's a loss. And so how do the parents stay objective and be a voice in the child's life and say the right things? So what I'm thinking about here is learning to accept loss as a servant of Jesus, because most of us are pretty good at accepting gain. Even though, as I'm going to share here, that has pitfalls too. Just because we have abundance and everything's great, that could lead to bad things in our life as well. So Paul's got a really good balance here. He says, I'm learning both extremes. I'm learning, some days I'm fleeing for my life. I have no clothes. I have no food. I'm hungry. I'm hunted. And other days I'm teaching at my own school for 3.5 years in Acts. I have plenty of food, friends surround me, comforts. The Dr. Luke's giving him massage and giving him medicine and patching up his wounds, and doing whatever Luke Doctor did, to put Paul back together after, But other times Luke Doctor's not there. He's in prison. There's nobody to say, everybody left him. So Paul's saying, I can do all of that through Christ. I can go through the hard times. I can go through the bad times. And so how do we live when God gives and when God takes away? And so, because as I shared the things this morning, I was highlighting the pattern of being faithful and God promoting and being faithful and God promoting. But in all those cases, when I left the farm, I walked away from it and let it go. I just passed over that like that was nothing, right? But it wasn't nothing, Every one of those cases when I left something, I experienced loss. I had to cope with that. And so I'd like to, kind of take Paul's words here as the lead-in and let's unpack that. What does it mean to be full and to be hungry? That he knew how to behave himself and conduct himself when he was hungry. He wanted to eat. He had nothing to eat, but, He said, I learned to be content. I can be just as content hungry as I can be full. What? That doesn't sound normal, but if we're going to follow Jesus, our experience is going to be like Paul's. We're not going to go to a plateau of everything is great, I have plenty of food, and just stay on that plateau the rest of our life. We're going to go through, whoop, now I'm down here, whoop, now I'm up here, whoop, now I'm down. We're going to go through those cycles, and we can't predict how and when those, sometimes the things that happen to Paul, one moment he's here, and the next moment he's being let down over a wall in a basket and running for his life. So he can go from hungry to full to hungry like that. Unpredictable. No time to prepare himself. Get ready for that. And so what we see Paul doing is he's in the context today of servant, and he's being faithful in both conditions. He's being just as faithful to God when he's hungry as when he's full. And there's no change in his, faithfulness percentage. That's just solid as rock going on. His circumstances are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. He's just steadily being faithful. Well, what's that like for a human? Because that's like pulling you this way and pulling you that way, and your emotions are up here and your emotions are down here, and you're 1 minute you're full and satisfied, and then you're growling with hunger, and what happens when you get hungry? You get irritable, right? Because you want to eat, right? And so you're dealing with all this fluctuating circumstances, and yet Paul says, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it through Christ who strengthens me. So I threw a bunch of stuff on paper quickly this morning to kind of create a little bit of grist for the mill. And what I'd like is just to go over this quickly and then talk. And you guys, talk and ask questions and share experiences or whatever, and edify each other, not just me. But Bill Gothard once said, and I don't espouse everything that Bill Gothard said and did, but God used him in my life to teach me some things. And one of the things he said was, let God deepen your life message before he expands your ministry. And I think what happens in the good times, our life message isn't getting very deep. We're just, we're living along in the good times. And then God takes us through hard times, and then when we say something, people can relate to it because they go through hard times too. So the deepening of the life message is a great thing, but it can be a hard, painful, loss-filled thing to get to where we have something to say that's worth something, And so I think that's what was happening to Paul. And so let's think about some Bible characters just quickly. Job had his life message deepened. How deep is the book of Job? I mean, have you plumbed the depths of Job? Have you gotten all the goodies out of Job that there's to get? I haven't. How deep a message God put in Job by taking away everything he had. Well, that's kind of a painful way to have your life message deepened. And then Joseph, he's the happy son, favored son of the father, boom, he's sold off to Egypt, new language, new culture. What does he do? Does he weep and cry and melt in the puddle and get depressed? And no, he rises to top servant, But he was having his life message deepened, but he was torn away from his dad. They had this bond, favored son bond, his and then unjustly thrown in jail. Another cycle of let's deepen that life message just a little further, Joseph, And he was, but what did Joseph do? He was faithful in both situations. Faithful as a servant in Potiphar's house, faithful as a servant in jail, and then God took him up to serving with the king. So what about Abraham? Abraham had his life message deepened. How long did God leave Abraham without a child? And so he's in this tension of wanting this child, and God just lets him wait. And so he's had all these men deepened their life messages through the times when they were being abased, more than say in the times when they were abounding. And so Paul said he knew how to experience both of these for his own benefit. So what are some of the temptations that happen when it's abounding? So what's abounding like? That's full, free time, not many worries, because we're not worrying about where our food and drink is coming from. So we're feeling good. Things are looking positive. Well, what happens is we can go into this the natural tendency of man when things abound is to relax and take it easy. And so when things are not abounding, you're vigilant. You're on guard because you feel like you're being attacked by these circumstances, and you've got to, protect yourself from loss, and you may be fleeing, you might, may be doing these things. And so when you get to that place of abounding, you can have this tendency to like, oh yeah, this is great, and just cast off restraint and take your fill of ease. And the Bible talks about fullness of bread and abundance of idleness, and get into this spirit of sleep and slumber, full and take another nap, full and take another nap, and and just bask. And so the rich man in Luke 2:19, 12:19, what did he say? He got this. He's our example. He says it for us. This is what humans do when everything's great. What does he say? What did the rich man say? I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat and drink and be merry. Take thine ease, right? And so that's the common attitude of somebody in the world. And people live this way. They think, if I could be a rich man, what are they saying? I could be at ease. I could be at rest. I could stop working. I could, I could have no more worries. There would always be money when I needed something. I could get it. And so, and the prodigal son is another example. What did he do? As soon as he got an abundance, what did he go do? He spent it in what's called riotous living. And so these are wrong response. This is not what Paul's talking about. I learned to be abound. When Paul abounded, he didn't do that. He didn't kick back and say, oh, great, no problems, no worries. He used the abounding time to prepare for another abased time. So it's kind of like soldiers in a battle. They go out and fight this battle, and the battle's over, and they come home, but what do? Sharpen their weapons, clean their weapons, learn some new skills, a mock fight. They're preparing for the next battle. And so if they go into that time of ease and don't do any preparing for the next battle, then they're more likely to be overcome. So Paul is saying, what are some right responses when we're abounding? Well, maintaining our discipline. Just the same as we did when, usually being abased pushes you into discipline. You're going to spend more time in prayer because you're desperate. You've got to get a hold of God. You want encouragement from the Word. You're going to talk to other brothers. You're going to look for counsel. You're going to get some wisdom. And so you're going to be investing all this time and energy into surviving the time when you're abased. And then what are you going to do with all those habits when you abound? Are you going to drop them and say, I don't need to read my Bible so much now. I don't need to pray so much now. I can relax and invest more time in entertainment and feeling good now. Are we going to do that? So when times abound, Christians should maintain their giving. You learn to give even in times when you're abased. God is going to ask you to give to people. Like the widow that took care of, was it Elisha or Elijah? The barrel of oil that didn't run out. God asked, she's abased. She has a meal left. And God says, please give some to the prophet. It's like he's asking her to sacrifice out of her abased mode, But it didn't really matter much because that was her last meal and she was going to die anyway, So, but she does, and then God leads her into abounding because everybody else is starving, but she has this barrel of flour and oil doesn't run out. So now she went to abound, with the prophet, and they survived together, So, but maintain your giving during your abounding time. Increase your giving. Now you have more resources. Now you can give out of your abundance. Keep that giving. That's what Paul did, I'm sure. He kept on giving. He's got lots of stuff. He's like, this people need, this people need, this people need. Keep that giving habit going. Don't give it up. And maintain your prayer. Prayer, the three things from the Sermon on the Mount: giving, praying, and fasting. Maintain these disciplines. So don't squander this time. Now that you have some relief, invest it. Keep investing it in prayer and keeping that discipline going. Maintain fasting. So the antidote to fullness of bread and abundance of idleness is to artificially induce hunger during the times when we're abounding, so that we don't forget. It's a good reminder. Oh yeah, what was it like to be hungry again? Oh yeah. Now I know. So fasting is another discipline that we can use during times of abounding to keep ourselves, kind of vigilant in the spiritual realm, and we don't become, like fat and lazy. So all these different kinds of personal disciplines, reading our Bible, quiet time, whatever we develop during those hard times that sustain us through those hard times, don't give those up just because the easy time came. And so what about how are we going to deal with when God takes away? So we were in an abounding thing, and now we went down, and God took away Isaac from Abraham, took away family from Joseph, took away all Job's children and wealth. How are we going to respond to that? So because I've went through a lot of this loss. I mean, it's not a normal thing for farmers to just go do a farm and then walk away from it and do another one and walk away from it. Most farmers, they stay, and then their children stay and their grandchildren. I mean, some farms in America, don't they have farms in America that, they're on their like 8th or 9th generation that's been in the family and they've kept them going, and so what's that like? Okay, well, I don't want to make it seem less hard than it is. It's hard. There's no way of getting around it. It's hard when God asks us to let go of something. But Amy Carmichael, she was a woman in India that was very wise and suffered many hard things. And she had this phrase, "In acceptance lieth peace." So this word acceptance is one of the 5 stages of grief. I don't know if you've ever studied the 5 stages of grief, but do yourself a favor. It's something that will help you prepare for life if you know what the 5 stages of grief are, because as you experience loss, you will watch yourself go through those 5 stages. And I'm not an expert on it. Some people say they happen in an order. Some people say they can be all out of order. You can go through, one before another, and somebody else, and then they can pop up again at different times. So 5 stages of grief are what they call denial. It's number 1, where you deny it's happening. You refuse to accept that it's happening. Well, when you get to the point where you're willing to admit that it's happening, this is true and I can't get away from it, you become angry. The second stage is to become angry and fight and say, "No way." And then when you realize your anger is to no avail, you're not going to prevent this loss through anger, you go into bargaining. Bargaining is stage 3, where you're trying to make some kind of a deal that can get me out of this. Well, what if I, and then you realize bargaining isn't going to work either, and then you can go into depression. Depression would be the 4th stage, where you're just like, you're fainting. You're in your spirit. You're giving up. You're not going to try anymore. You're done. And then the 5th stage is acceptance. And that's when you go back to your proper emotional and mental health, because now you're accepting it. So when you see me talk like I did this morning about going through letting go of all these farms, you're observing me at the end of this 5 stages of grief, and I'm in acceptance. So at every one of those points where God took a farm away from me, I've had accepted that. And so you don't see me like crying or troubled or worried or pouting or doing any of the other stages. So it makes it look, well, he's okay. It wasn't any big deal. No, it's not that way. It was a big deal. It was hard and it was troublesome. And so the letting go of something when God takes it away, it takes time. Okay, it takes time. It's not something that happens instantly. So you have to give yourself time. It also requires grace from God. He gives us grace for these things that happen to us, and it also requires the Scriptures, because the Scriptures are where we get comfort. So as we're going through these losses, there's like Psalms, and you can just live off those Psalms, because they're comforting you, they're feeding you, they're letting you know that God knows what you're going through, and He sees, and so you can take God's promises, and you're propping yourself up, So that's important. And we can be tempted to rebel against, when God does a loss, takes us into a period of loss, we can quit. We can say, well, I'm not following God anymore. I didn't sign up for this. If this is the way, I served God so hard, if this is the way He's going to treat me, why should I keep serving Him, And the Bible calls that being offended. You're following God until He does something terrible in your life and takes something away, and now you're offended and you're saying, no more, not anymore. People get angry at God, spend years of their life saying, I'm not having anything to do with God. He took away my mother when I was 3 years old, or whatever the case may be. People do that. And so can rebel, or we can give up. And I think about Job's wife. Everybody picks on her and criticizes her, but she said what she said. But think about what she was going through. Okay, Job had a lot of servants. She probably had personal, close relationships with lots of those servants. Probably some of them grew up on her knee, and were like community. They were like community. They were like family, and not just losing all these servants, then losing her children. 10 children in one day, and I guess we can give her a little space to be upset. Maybe what stage is she in? Is she in anger? When she says, well, just curse God and die, maybe she's in that stage of grief. And I love Job's response. He doesn't condemn her. He says, you're talking like one of the foolish women. He's saying, I know you're not a foolish woman, but you're talking like one right at the moment, And maybe it was out of character for her. Maybe that wasn't how she normally reacted to life, but now she's in this situation with him. And women handle things harder emotionally than men. She's a lot more attached to those children than Job is. And so out of the midst of all this, her trouble, she speaks. And so we have to give each other some space. Don't be too hard on each other when somebody reacts in a negative way when God takes them through a time of loss. I'm sure I didn't handle them all to perfection, And so these are some things to think about as we consider. Our life is not going to be 100% in the abased mode all the days of our life. And neither is it going to be in the abound mode all the days of our life. God will take us purposely through cycles where we have the abounding and we have the abasing. And he wants us to learn things in both of those cycles. And so anyway, let's open it up for discussion or thoughts or verses or experiences or questions or whatever anybody would like to add. Let this be like a talking time, not just me talking time.
So I had two things. One, both relating to your guys' take about how we relate with two things relating to how we relate with our kids. Because and I guess the first one is how how do we help prepare our children for those seasons? And I guess one of the things that I've seen, and I don't know that I guess I've maybe experienced it or thought of myself, but kind of that, things are going well right now. When is God gonna bring the next boom? And just kind of living in that, what's gonna happen? That's gonna happen. And I know people who kind of live in that almost cynical, I know God's gonna do something bad to me soon.
So there's an apprehension.
Right, so there's an apprehension. So how do we help our kids and ourselves, not live in that? Because that's not, kind of what I love what you said about how Paul was, he basically was ready. When I was working at Miracle Mountain Ranch, we talked about bomb-proofing horses. Bomb-proof horses. So have any of you ever been on a trail ride at a camp or a ministry or even those horses are the most boring horses in the world, right? Because you get on them and it's kind of like they're not even cognizant that you're on top. They have their routine, they do the thing. You could do all kinds of things and they won't get out of their line, they won't do anything. And on the one hand, as a person who, if you're not really familiar with horses, that could be great. That's great. You like being on this horse, that's totally rock solid. If you know anything about horses and really want to ride, those horses are absolutely the most frustrating horses to deal with because they are so deadened to anything that the last thing they're going to pay any attention is some idiot on my head or my back who is thinking is going to tell me where I should go. I'm not going to pay attention. When I was at the ranch, our first level of training when we were learning how to do some horse training was working with these with these trail ride horses. And you know, the first thing we had to do is to get them sensitive to, like, yes, when I pull on your rein, that really does mean I want you to do this. I know you had people jerking on your head and everything. Anyway, so there's a lot of negative things you can say about trail horses, but one of the beauties of them, they have been so conditioned that they don't get bent out of shape when someone does something sudden or jerks on their head or whatever, because that's just it's life. And I've got my course here that I'm going on, and it's good, it's fine. And
So you're saying a bomb could go off?
so that's what we would say, a bomb-proof horse, because horses are naturally incredibly fearful creatures, and the slightest whatever, if it's unusual or unfamiliar or whatever, will just absolutely send them crazy. So the goal for trainers with trail ride horses is to help condition them so much that nothing is going to shock them, nothing's going to surprise them, and they can still faithfully carry out safely their responsibility. So I guess in my mind, I'm kind of thinking, how do we help cultivate bomb-proof kids that are able to, you know, go through those seasons? And the second part is, how do I, as a dad, be able to enter into grief with my kids over their trials? Because of course, as an adult and as their dad, you know, I look at their trials and say, okay, this is really not anything to cry about. And you know, I love what a comedian said once. You know, I've tried to remember it, but he's like, you know, he said I understand parents who, they take Johnny to the fair and Johnny gets a balloon, and you know, Johnny loves his balloon, and you know, Johnny's only 6, and you're leaving the fair and Johnny accidentally lets go of his balloon, and his balloon is gone, and Johnny just goes to pieces, right? And he said, I don't understand the parents are just like, oh, get over it, Johnny, why are you crying? It's just a balloon. And he said, what if you, Mr. Dad, saw your wallet just start flying up into the air, and you're going crazy about your wallet? Someone says, what's your problem? It's just a wallet. And I like that, because it's kind of like, okay, so and where's that balance, I guess, to where on the one hand you want to help your kids be able to handle those extremes that they're going to encounter in their life, especially the times of loss, but also enter into it with sensitivity. Because I think my tendency as a dad with my kids is I want to help them through it and get to where they're not, you know, it's like, understand, you know, be tough, get back up, it's okay, this is not that big of a deal, just let it go and move on. And thankfully there's been a couple times where I've been able to at least step back and understand, okay, I need to understand that this is something that's hard for them, and let them go through those griefs. So what do you guys got any?
When Tim was talking about the knowing how to be abased or how bound, going through times of feasting and lots of, you know, provision, and other times of starvation or hunger or whatever. I was reminded of Proverbs 15:15. It says, all the days of the afflicted are evil, but he that is of a merry heart hath a continual feast.
15 what?
15:15. Mm. And how the verse is talking about how, you know, if you're afflicted in your spirit, all your days are going to be evil, whether you're abased or whether you're bound. But if your heart is merry, then it will be as though you have a continual feast. And then the next verse, which I just now read, verse 16 says, better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. And I think that's the answer to this conundrum, is this paradox, is even if you have little, if you have the fear of God, if you have the understanding that God loves me and that his ways are perfect and that he's sovereign over the situation that I'm in, then you can have that merry heart, which is a continual feast. But yet, if all you have is great treasure, and with it, you're going to have trouble. So it's better to have little with the fear of the Lord than great trouble, than great treasure and trouble therewith. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith.
Mm-hmm.
So think of how it's easy to have, well, if you have if you're in a place of contention, it's often easy to have that when you've got plenty. Or a stall ox is an example of plenty. But I think that's so I think the solution that God helped Paul find was that he saw the sovereignty and the love of God in his situations, in his circumstances, and he was able to have that merry heart. Because when I'm not sure about anybody else, but when I have God's eternal perspective in my situation, then God gives me joy. That's the only way to have happiness and contentment. And joy is that recognition of who God is and his love for me and his sovereignty in a situation. And that suddenly your perspective becomes different. It's like you were able to rise above the circumstance and see the situation from a totally different perspective. And it gives hope and joy. Kind of like that movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Honey, I what?
Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Shrunk?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where this mad scientist shrinks his kids accidentally.
Oh.
And they're the size of this little ant, or smaller than an ant. And they're running around the backyard, and their lawn grass is these massive trees and stuff, and they're just trying to make it out of their backyard, stay alive. And how, when we don't have God's perspective, it's like we're down in the weeds, or down in, these little miniature creatures, and our problem seems so massive. A drop of water looks like this torrential flood to us. And the best way I've been able to see that contrast is when you're flying, because when you're down on the ground, everything seems so big. Trees seem so huge, rivers and lakes seem so giant, and things that people account as wonderful and amazing when you're up in the air, suddenly it's nothing. Oh, that's somebody's massive mansion, and from the air it's like, oh, it's a little toy house. And these mountains that seem so big, when you get up in the air, that's like a little bump in a rug of carpet. It's just your perspective changes, and how that's, I think, when we have God's perspective, when we recognize God's sovereignty in our lives, we're able to have a totally different perspective of our circumstances, which gives, I think, ultimately, when it gives worship and praise to God. That's how we can get to that point of worshiping Him. It's amazing to fly down through the mountains of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. It's just incredibly gorgeous. And you can't have that perspective when you're down in the weeds of your circumstances. So I guess that's...
How have you helped your kids get there or begin to get there?
I guess there's been times when I've seen our kids squabbling over a seemingly insignificant little matter between themselves or what have you, and I think first thing is recognizing when they're going through that circumstance and not just passing over it as insignificant. But I think I'm not sure if I've done a very good job at doing that a lot, but sometimes I just have to sit them down and say, look, you need to have God's perspective here. You need to be following what Jesus said and to do what Jesus said and to love your enemies. And right now, this other sibling might be an enemy of yours, and you need to learn to love them and to be doing good to those who are despiteful to you. I think pointing them to the sovereignty of God and His love for us is also what I've tried to do. We've tried to do it. We're still working on it, though.
Well, along with the siblings that are, fighting over little things, how children will sometimes be like, well, that's mine, or that's mine. And, so we always just tried to not have that vocabulary in our home, that this was mine. And, the idea is, as Christians, that we're to hold everything loosely, that it's, nothing's mine. We're just a servant, like we said this morning. I mean, we're servants, and we're to be faithful with what He's given us while we're here. And that's not always easy. I was reminded this morning in Matthew 19:29, and this is Jesus speaking, and everyone that hath forsaken houses, or brethren, or sisters, or fathers, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, shall receive 100-fold, and shall inherit everlasting life. But many that are first shall be last, and last shall be first. And one of the hardest things, I think, for us, desiring to go overseas has been the idea, Tim, you've had to give up so many farms and lands, that there is a relationship you have with the land when you till it. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's interesting that Jesus doesn't deny that land is something, houses, family, maybe there's difficult relationships that God, Christ came to divide and separate. And sometimes, that idea of forsaking all to follow Him, but yet it says that we're going to have 100-fold, and it says, other lands. So, we might end up in Cambodia, and there'll be other lands. And like Tim had farms in China and, Mongolia. And so I guess it's just a perspective, that it's not, we don't hold too tightly to things, and try to teach your children to not hold too tightly to things, and that's hard, and sometimes those times are painful for them, but it's better that they experience that when they're children than when they're adults and they don't, it's better they experience that times of not having everything, otherwise they'll just be spoiled. Mm-hmm. So
it reminds me of when Robert Boyle is a well-known scientist from back in the 1600s in England, his father was quite wealthy, owned lots of land, and he, for some reason, he thought it was important that his kids grow up without having a lot initially. So he actually sent Robert Boyle as a very young child, probably 1 or 2, to live with this very poor family in his area, and they raised him until he was probably about 6 or 7. Even though he was very wealthy, he could have provided everything for
Are
his
you
son.
serious? I never heard such a thing.
Robert.
Yeah.
Huh. Robert Boyle's dad did that to him?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And so then he took him out of that and then raised him, educated him, and so forth later on. I'm not sure exactly what age that was that he transitioned in, but I thought that was really interesting to see how his father intentionally, from the story that I was told, there was a sower series book there. He intentionally raised him in an impoverished environment to begin with. So he ended up becoming a very successful scientist and a Christian.
That's interesting because I had a friend who traveled around the world. His dad was a soil mapper for the UN, so his dad went everywhere mapping soils, and he tagged along. So he lived on all 8 continents and had all these experiences. And when he got bigger, he went into the New Age movement, and he would travel in Europe, and sometimes he'd run out of everything, and he'd have to eat out of the trash cans, to stay alive. And he was saying, you think you won't, but when you're that hungry, you will. Eat out of those trash. And he said this thing one time, sound similar to like this thing about Paul. He said, my greatest fear in life for my children is that they will never know hunger. That's what he said after all those experiences and that, because he recognized that hunger had a benefit for their character and development. And anyway, I've never heard anybody say something like that, but he had experienced real hunger and abasement. He was realizing the abasement had a positive, like Boyle's dad must have perceived that somehow, that he would do that. One of the comments I wanted to make was, so you go through these experiences where you love something. It could be a person, it could be a farm, or land, or whatever. And then you start going through these cycles of having things taken away. So the next time you get a chance to love something, you can have this tendency to hold back and not love, because I don't want to get attached because I'm just going to have to let go. But that's not a healthy way to live life. It's better to love hard and love intensely and love deeply and then bear the grief of letting go, rather than to not love at all, because you might have to let go. So, when God gives us something, it says, love one another with a pure heart fervently. You don't know when you're going to lose them, but while you have them, love them with all you got, And I think that's important perspective to have. Don't, just because we recognize the risk, a healthy way to cope with it isn't to not love. It's to love more, love better. I think, and some people have said such things in other words, like I think Jim Elliot had a good quote about loving people. And then another thing, one of the things, Gary, was like, how did you keep going, or how did you overcome? Well, somehow early in my life, I got this commitment. I ended up developing a commitment. And I don't know where I learned it exactly or why, but I would not leave the place God put me until He said. That was like I had a zero tolerance policy for moving without God's permission. I would not do it. And so most of these circumstances He put me in were very intense, and I wanted out. Like at the farm, my mom's farm in Virginia, I have 12 brothers and sisters. We're trying to get along, and my relationship with my mom was tough. It was very tough, and I did not want, I wanted out, but I refused to get out until God said go. And I think that, and then when He does say go, go. So like the farm we were at in China, there was some missionaries that came and served there in China with our organization, and they got totally burned out and really like devastated, and they had to go back to the States, and it took them years to recover. And somebody said they stayed longer than God's grace was extended to keep them there. He was wanting them to go, and they didn't go, and then they just, So God gives you grace for those circumstances, but if he tells you to leave those circumstances and you decide to stay, you don't have the grace to stay now. You have grace to go. And he says, go. So, going, if he says stay and you go, you don't have grace to go. You have grace for staying. And so you've got to be, I think that saved me untold grief in my life. And so with my mom's farm, I stayed. At my next farm, I had intense relationship struggles with my brother-in-law over how to run that farm. Wanted out so bad, but stayed until God. And then the next farm I went to, I was working with the Korean leadership, and I had worse disagreements with them about how to run that farm than I ever had with my brother-in-law. And within 2 years, I wanted out, And for 5 years, God was quiet, didn't say a thing. And then finally, he spoke, and I went. I left, But that's just a key. I was talking to a psychologist the other day, and he said humans have to develop the ability to tolerate tension. We don't like tension, and he said usually people have one or two responses: they avoid it or they get angry. And so he started talking about Moses going through the wilderness, how God put Moses in this situation. He's got all these people, and they're ready to stone him because they don't have food or drink. And Moses is in the middle of this tension, and he gets angry and strikes the rock. And it was like, how are we going to deal like I did with these different places I was, and I wanted out, I had to develop the ability to endure that tension and persist and just keep going and let that tension stay there and not try to get out from under it. It's not nice.
And it seems like a huge thing to model for kids, because the kids' natural tendency is already going to be to, as soon as anything starts getting uncomfortable or to bail, and they're going to be looking at us too, I guess, and seeing, well, how are mom and dad handling things when things get rough? Do they just fail, or do they get angry? How do they, and being able to, because I think seems like that's an important thing, and somehow you picked that up from somewhere when you were pretty young already, to make that commitment to stay just because things were difficult if God hadn't told you to go.
It's like the pillar of cloud and fire in the desert. They moved when it moved and they didn't when it didn't. And if we can lock into God, and when he moves, us move, and when he doesn't, stay put. It'll help. It's one thing that I've done. Gary's asking the question, how'd you overcome? Well, that's one way. And that was like unbreakable in my life. I wouldn't do it. I wanted out so bad, but I would not go. Until he said so. Yeah. He said if you would go at those points, it's actually the worst thing you could do for your life, because he's trying to teach you certain set of skills and abilities in that setting to prepare you for the next thing. And if you opt out, well then now you have to repeat that, because he was trying to get you ready for this. So yeah. And I think of Abraham wanting that child. He was in that. He had to tolerate that tension all those years of being childless and wanting that. Well, he wanted out of that circumstance more than anything else. And then God comes along and promises him, and still doesn't do it. And it's like, God, are you teasing? It's like he's upping the tension. Anyway, and then he had his failure. They tried to do what that Ishmael. But God didn't condemn him for that. He didn't accept that. Anyway.
It did add to his tension, though.
Yes.
You're right. He had to go back around again, and he had the extra tension. We're still dealing with his tension. It's so it's past 12, so I guess we should probably wrap up.
Okay. Do you want to pray?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you for these insights from your word, and also from the things you've taught Tim and the other men here, and think of the young men who are with us, that they'd be encouraged and blessed by these things. And we just thank you that you have promised that you'll give us the strength to go through times of plenty and times of poverty, times of abounding and times of abasement. So help us to be content and at peace no matter what you bring our way, knowing that you've got a purpose for it. And we just commit the rest of the day to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.